做这个交流。那么这一次呢，他又来，今年他又带来16位美国的这个一些大学的本科生，还有这些教授，2位教授带着他们过来。那么今天呢，就是说这个开明在这里呢会给我们讲一讲，介绍一下他们的学校、他们的同学，然后呢，包括呢我们后面要做的项目，所以让我们再次欢迎这个开明的教授。
大家好，我特别不好意思，因为你们的英文水平比我的中文水平特别高，所以呢，我应该用英语给你们一个介绍我们的研究。但是有问题的话，可以跟对一个5、6岁的小孩问我一样。So okay. Now you know why I'm speaking in English. So, today what I would like to do is to give you kind of an overview of the kinds of questions that I think are particularly interesting comparing education in China and the United States, and then also introduce a project that we want to try this year where small groups of students from your class and from a class that a colleague of mine is teaching in the University of Michigan can collaborate on collecting some data that I think will be interesting. So, I want to talk about some general points about research and the importance of cross-cultural research, talk particularly about the importance of preschool and what adults know about education, and introduce the projects that we're going to do very, very quickly. So I thought I'd begin by challenging you with a question. Let's imagine that I could answer any question about education and development that you have, and I could give you the true answer. So what kind of question would you like to ask? So you think a few minutes, and then please ask some questions. Please. What kind of knowledge? What? We can or can't? Can't. Okay. Okay. I suspect you probably can answer that question yourself. What kind of question, though, do you really wonder about? Would you like to know the answer to? When you decide to study psychology, for example, what kinds of questions did you hope to know the answer to when you graduated? How to do research? Okay. Hannah? What is education?
Finish your thesis.
Finish your thesis. Finish your thesis. That's not really a question, it's a goal, but okay.
What is education goal?
Okay. I'll just add 4 here. Okay. What else? Okay. How about this? How can I live? Better. Okay. So these are a few questions. They're actually pretty different questions. And I suspect that when you came to college, if you can remember back then, that the kinds of questions that you had were probably more like this kind of question and this kind of question. Right? So how can I become a better person? What is education? What should I learn? Should I spend my time learning about the internet and computers, or should I spend my time reading classic books from Chinese history? I mean, what should I do? When you have a child, you'll have all sorts of questions about how you will raise that child. I don't know what Shulasher's experience is, but I know my wife is a physician, and I'm a developmental psychologist. And when our baby was born, we realized that all of a sudden that we really didn't know anything. We had to decide, is this a serious problem? Is this not a serious problem? What we should do? And we realized that a lot of what we knew didn't really help us very much. I don't know if this is your experience, but I think most people who study psychology go to college with these kind of big general questions, and then when they leave, the kinds of questions they have are how to do research, how can I finish my thesis, and so on, that probably when they came to college they wouldn't recognize. So one of the things that's really disappointing, I think, in a research course is that you learn that the kinds of questions that you really want to answer are difficult or impossible to answer. Maybe you're all wasting your time here, and you should go leave and get a job and get some practical experience. That's a decision you have to make. American students worry about that a lot. Graduate students worry about that all the time. I'm not sure it's the same here, but this is an important question. There's a famous psychologist named George McConkie that Professor Shu knows very well. And he said that whenever his students would come to him and ask about doing an experiment, he would say, well, would you bet your life on this? Not because he was going to kill them, but because to really do a study takes 6 months, or takes a year, or takes a year and a half. And then that's part of your life that's gone. And if you've wasted your time, then you've wasted your time and you never get that back. That deciding to come here, study psychology, do this kind of research, participate in this project or that project, these are really important questions. And these kinds of questions, psychology and research doesn't really help us answer very well. Now, why did I bring this up? Not to make you feel bad, but because I think that this has some implications for the kind of research that we do. So, I would say that most of the questions that we really want to answer are very difficult to answer. When you go home during Spring Festival and talk to your relatives, they probably ask you lots of questions about schooling and children and so on that you can't answer. And if you came back and asked Professor Shu, probably she couldn't answer them either. That a lot of the most important questions that we want to know are difficult or impossible to answer. Now, why is this? Well, one reason is, it's not because researchers don't work very hard or because they're not very smart, because you know that that's not true. But one big problem is that there's not very much variation in how we raise our children in a given society at a given point in time. That if you go into a classroom in Beijing and you go into another class in Hong Kong, that even though these societies are far apart and they have some different administrative structures, in fact, there's a lot of similarity in how children are taught. So how can we get around this? Well, I think comparative research can be one answer, because different societies can vary quite a bit more than a single society can, And change over time is also really pretty impressive. But so what kind of comparative research is most valuable? One question that I really recommend to all of you who think about becoming researchers is asking, what can you do that people will care about 50 years from now? And there's an interesting way, I think, to find an answer to that. You can go in the library and look at old journal articles from 50 years ago. And in this case, probably journal articles in the West, where there was a strong active research tradition then, and see what's interesting to you. I did that once, and one of the things that I found was that the research articles that in some ways have the most prominence at a given point in time are really not that interesting down the road. So 50 years ago, people were still doing things like behaviorism and they were doing very, very clever studies that now no one cares about. But there were some articles that are still pretty interesting. Those that describe how children were taught or what children's lives were like, that those sorts of phenomena are still pretty interesting. So let me ask you a different question now. What would you like to know about Chinese children's lives from 50 years ago compared to now? Obviously, 50 years ago was a very interesting time in the history of China. But what would you like to know about what, say, elementary school children's lives were like then compared to now? Take just a minute, see if people have a couple of questions. Right, so during those days, clearly they didn't have computers and PowerPoint and so on.
They live in environments with chaos.
Oh, chaos. Well, yeah, probably 1962 was sort of kind of in between two periods of chaos, but yeah. Okay. Well, let me leave this for a second. We may come back to this later if we have time. But generally, I would argue that what endures over time aren't the kinds of theory-based studies, because theories always change, but rather rich descriptions of important phenomena. And at this point in time, I think technology helps us enormously to try to record interesting events in a way that people in the future can use them to ask their own questions. Let's imagine, for example, you had a sample of mathematics lessons in Beijing 50 years ago. You could look at all sorts of interesting questions about how children related to their teachers, or the kinds of questions that teachers ask, or student participation that people at that point might have thought were perfectly ordinary, but to you might seem really interesting. I think there isn't any kind of record like this, but it's really too bad. And I hope that one of the things that we can do is make sure that 50 years from now, people will have a better sense of what life was like for children in Beijing at this point in time. Now, let me stress that the point that I've made is kind of non-standard, right? That generally the model that everyone learns is you have some kind of theory from which you develop a hypothesis, you do a study that confirms or usually disconfirms the theory, and then you revise the theory and so on. The standard view is very important, but I think it's pretty limited, and personally, as I grow older, I'm not as content with these limits. Now, raising children means making choices. And a lot of these choices are implicit. So things that you're not even aware of making. But these can change over time. And let me talk about how they've changed over time some in the United States, in my country that I'm familiar with. There was a famous book by an early behaviorist named John B. Watson in 1930 telling American parents how to raise their children. And let me read a quote from this book. So here's what he told parents. Never hug and kiss them. Never let them sit on your lap. If you must, kiss them once on the forehead when they say goodnight. Shake hands with them in the morning. Give them a pat on the head if they've made an extraordinarily good job of a difficult task. Try it out. In a week's time, you will find out how easy it is to be perfectly objective with your child and at the same time kindly. You will be utterly ashamed of the mawkish, sentimental way you've been handling it. The word mawkish is somebody who's, too emotional. So he felt that parents in those days were too emotional with their children and they should be more strict and treat them on a schedule almost as though the children were employees rather than part of a family. Now, about 15 years later, a new and very influential book came out from a man named Dr. Spock. And here's his description, which turned out to be extremely influential. It was a book that, in the United States, right after World War II, there was something called the baby boom, where many parents had children, and often they'd moved away from their parents, and so they didn't know how to raise their children, and so they bought this book, and this was a guide for how to be a parent. Now, the first part of this sounds like he's exactly talking about J.B. Watson. Of course, you could create a harsh system of rewards and punishments so that, like good little robots, your children would behave perfectly most of the time. But what would be the effect on the child's spirit, on his sense of self-worth, on his personal happiness, or on his feelings toward others? On the other hand, you can imagine a child whose every whim is slavishly indulged and whose every action, good or bad, is lavishly praised. Such a child might have a certain measure of happiness, but most people wouldn't want to get within 10 feet of him. Your delicate task is to teach your child the how and why of acceptable behavior, but never at the expense of a sense of self-worth and optimism. So, in a period of 15 years, the advice that parents got had changed really enormously. And it would be very interesting to see how that related to the way children turned out. So now I'd like to take a few minutes and ask you to think about how values have changed in China. So what I'd like you to do is maybe get in a group of about 5 to 10 people, and very quickly, we'll only take about 5 to 10 minutes, and come up with an answer to this question. How do you think your parents were brought up differently than they brought you up? And then when you become a parent, how will your child be raised differently than you were? Okay? So let's take just about 5 minutes, and please talk to the people around you, and I'll see what you come up with. Okay, let's come back together so we can hear what the groups came up with. So who would like to report very quickly on what you came up with for these two questions? Please, maybe someone from your group raise your hand and give me a report, please. Please.
My mother was a little girl. She had to look after her younger sister and younger brother, and had every little food. And she had to do some a lot of housework and didn't have much time to play. But when I was a little girl, I'm the only girl in my family, and my grandmother and my grandfather they all looked after me.
Sure.
And I didn't have to do any housework.
Sure.
And I just stay with the other girls in the street. And
Sure. So certainly there's much more freedom now than there used to be. And how about when, if you have a child, how will you raise her?
I think they would be taking after more. What's that? They may have better food and better
Sure.
care. They have different games. They like I thought that's that.
Sure. But will you try to give them more freedom, or will you give them chores to do, or what's your idea?
Maybe more freedom. I would like them to choose what they like and what they want to learn, and all they just want to see when they were very young.
Okay. So, I mean, this is an interesting question, because some parents feel, well, children don't really know what they want to do, and it's better for the parents to tell them, here, this is a good way to spend your time. And some parents may feel it's very important, a lot of American parents feel it's very important for children to have a job to do around the house, so they feel that they have their own responsibility. Whereas other parents, in China often parents will say, well, children, if you're a child, your job is to be a student, so you shouldn't have to do some work around the house on top of it. You should concentrate on this job. Okay, good. Who else came up with something, please?
In the 60s, my parents were living in such a environment that their parents just wanted them make a living, have a job, and don't die. And
Right.
now, our parents are expected maybe too much from us. So they will send us to those extracurricular and our school program, so we can get a better, get into a better university, and be well qualified for the society.
Sure. I mean, I imagine that many of your parents didn't have the opportunity to come to college and study, and so that they really put a lot of pressure on you to be able to achieve this dream that they had. Now, what about when you have a child?
As for the second question, I haven't thought too much because I haven't thought that far. I don't even imagine planning my wedding. So
Sure. Okay.
Haven't
Right.
thought about the second question. But if I have a child, I think I will teach them as the same way as my parents.
Okay.